Following up now on Decision 2022, Nebraska passed the initiative to increase the state's minimum wage.
58% voted for an incremental increase of Nebraska's minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2026. 42% voted against it.
Now that passage leads to the question about how other communities near us will be impacted.
Some, like Council Bluffs, are just an easy drive across the river. 6 News' Marlo Lundak found out the business community isn't as concerned as some might think.
In January, Nebraska's minimum wage will jump from $9 to $10.50. The ACLU of Nebraska says the move will begin to address pay inequity for Nebraskans of color, especially women of color. But besides jobs in the service industry, many of which come with tips, the majority of businesses already pay above the minimum wage.
We're considerably over what the first couple of years' increases are. After that, we'll be needing to increase wages here.
That's why business owners across the river in Council Bluffs are not worried about employees ditching jobs there to work in Omaha.
It'll definitely be something we watch because you have to do that as a border community to remain competitive.
Drew Camp is the president and CEO of the Council Bluffs Chamber of Commerce.
So we've really seen the marketplace play out insofar that there's very few employers that you'll find here, regardless of what industry, paying less than $15 an hour.
Iowa's minimum wage still sits at just $7.25. But Camp says a mass exodus of employees leaving to work in Omaha is unlikely.
But with just the natural nature right now of the workplace and the constraints that are on the workforce and the talent attraction and retention pieces, this simply just based on supply and demand, we're seeing employers have to pay much higher, double the current minimum wage here in Iowa of $7.25 just to even attract people and get them in the door, that alone retain them.
On your site in Council Bluffs, Marlo Lundak, 6 News.